Today, our mini-series takes us to Florida. But before we get started, welcome to True Crime with Maneater. If you love all things true crime, including missing person cases, cold cases, and just the strange happenings of the world, you've come to the right place. Of course, I would love for you to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss a video upload. Let's get started. A South Florida serial killer would soon become known between February 1975 and January of 1976. This serial killer's crimes would become known as the Flat Tire Murders. Investigators believe that when this offender committed his first two known murders, he had deflated the tires of the victims' cars. This person's suspected victim count included 12 girls and women found drowned in the intracoastal waterway within a short distance of each other. Although some forensic experts have questioned whether it was a single offender, others have claimed that the murderer could have killed more than 30 women in multiple states. In the afternoon of July 22nd, a 27-year-old respiratory therapist named Roddie Sue Gorlin stopped at the Asthmatic Children's Foundation in North Miami Beach, and she wanted to catch up with some of her old co-workers. She had lived in South Florida her whole life and had been living with her fiance in Pennsylvania for about a year before returning to visit her parents for a few weeks, as she planned her upcoming wedding. So she would stop in and chat with her coworkers and tell them all about her wedding plans. She would say that she was going to stop at 163rd Street Shopping Center before heading to the Parkway General Hospital around 2 p.m. to see her mother, who was in the hospital for a stomach bug. Unfortunately, she would never make it to the hospital. Later that night, a mall security guard would call North Miami Beach police to have her rental car towed after it was found abandoned with a flat tire, blocking traffic in the parking lot. Unfortunately, the next morning, a surveying crew would stumble across her nude body floating in the Grand Canal in northwest Miami-Dade County. An autopsy would later reveal that she was raped and sexually mutilated before drowning in the canal. Elise Rapp was a 21-year-old New York native who moved to Miami for work in June of 1975. The 21-year-old had headed out to do some shopping at the Hollywood Mall. Unfortunately, her body would be found floating in the Grand Canal just 10 blocks from where Ronnie was found the week before. She was wearing a gold chain necklace bearing the Hebrew symbol for life, and unfortunately, she had been sexually assaulted before she was struck over the head and drowned in the canal. The same medical examiner would note that she was sexually mutilated in a very similar but more vicious way than Ronnie Gorlin. Her car was found abandoned in the parking lot of Sears at the Hollywood Mall, and one of the tires was flat. Police would pretty much instantly pick up on the connection. Police would determine that this killer would watch for the women as they go into the mall. He would then go to their car, deflate the tire, and then wait for them to return. He would approach them and say, "Do you need help?" And they would say, "Yeah, my car is deflated. I don't know what to do." So of course they viewed him as a good Samaritan. Unfortunately, they were met with horrendous violence. After the discovery of these two women, police first thought that there was a serial killer now active in 2 counties, until they realized that perhaps it was one person. 20-year-old Judith Ann Osterling went missing on February 1st, 1975 from Miami-Dade County after returning home from her job at a massage parlor. 2 days later, her body was found in the canal bordering Broward and Miami-Dade. 17-year-old Arietta Marie Rennie Tinker was dropped off by her husband at the Hippopotamus Lounge on Hollywood Beach at around 1 p.m. on April 9th, 1957. Her husband would ask if she wanted a ride home, but she just said that she would find her own way back. Her last known whereabouts was at Loom's restaurant near Young Circle, a little over half a mile from her home. Unfortunately, 3 days later, her body was found floating in the Snake Creek Canal, about half a mile east of Highway 27, just north of the Dade-Broward line, and it was found approximately the same area where Judith was found less than 3 months earlier. They did believe that she drowned, and there were no obvious signs of foul play, but detectives suspected she was murdered because they couldn't explain how else she would wind up dead so far away without her car. On February 12, 1975, Barbara Davis Stevens, who was 21, left her parents' home in southwest Miami around 7 p.m., and she told her father that she was going to visit a friend in Coral Gables. On her way, she stopped at the Golden Triangle store across the mall. She bought a couple records, but then seemingly disappeared. Later the next afternoon, a concerned coworker would find her Camaro abandoned in the parking lot of the Gold Triangle. Her doors were unlocked, the keys were in the ignition, and there were traces of blood on the steering wheel. Unfortunately, on February 20th, her body was discovered in a patch of woods behind a grocery store. She had been wearing the same clothes she disappeared in, but her pants were pulled down and one of her shoes was lying a short distance from her body. She had been stabbed multiple times, and there was blood, dust, and grass found in and on her Camaro, which led detectives to believe that her killer used the car to transport her body to the dump site and then returned it back to the Gold Triangle. Nancy Lee Fox was a 19-year-old who moved to Fort Lauderdale in early 1975, who was trying to get away from a love triangle involving her sister and a young man named William Moore Jr. Unfortunately, she was last seen on the night of June 13th. And many newspaper articles say that she was hitchhiking, walking to a local laundromat, or had just left work because she felt ill and was walking back to her apartment when she disappeared. 2 days later, her body was found floating in the canal. She had been struck over the head with a blunt object and choked before she was thrown into the water. Although police had 2 suspects in Nancy's case, they still couldn't solve it. One of those suspects had been the man she was in a love triangle with. 2 14-year-old girls, Barbara Susan Schreiber and Belinda Darlene Zetterohrer, left Barbara's home on the evening of June 18th, and they said that they were going to spend the night at their friend Valerie's home. Unfortunately, the next day, their bodies would be found lying side by side along the canal. Both had been shot once with a large caliber bullet, and due to the large amount of blood at the scene, investigators believe that both of them were killed on the spot. Although they were both fully clothed, there are conflicting reports about whether they were sexually assaulted. On July 10th, a family vacationing from Fort Myers spotted an arm sticking out of the Highway 27 canal, about 10 miles south where Barbara, Darlene, and Nancy were found. The body was identified as Robin Leslie Losh, who was a 14-year-old girl reported missing by her parents 2 days earlier. She had failed to return home from summer classes at her high school. The autopsy did say that she drowned, but investigators sharply disagree over whether she was a victim of a murder or an accident. The perpetrator was described as a white male between 20 and 25 who was well-dressed, physically athletic, attractive, possibly married, likely intelligent with an above-average IQ, and a sexual sadist. They said because he was charming, his victims would trust him and they would get in his car. According to a sergeant in California, the flat tire murderer was possibly responsible for upwards of 30 murders across several states since the early 1970s, and that started in California. These killings would stop in December of 1973, but 9 similar murders were recorded in Washington the following year, but stopped in September. And then more killings would happen in Idaho, Utah, and Colorado. In most cases, they said the victims physically resembled each other. They were beaten and raped before death. The killer would strip the bodies and throw them in canals, streams, or leave them near embankments. There's a total of 35 murders, which they connect to this one person, although it hasn't been proven. Another woman who arrived in Fort Lauderdale from Pennsylvania in October of 1975 rented a room for a 1-week stay at the Lauderdale Beach Club. Unfortunately, her body was found strangled with a rope 9 days later in a dump outside the city. Michelle Winters was a 17-year-old girl who was supposedly the 12th and final victim. Her body was found floating in the Snapper Creek and Pembroke Pines in January of 1976. She was last seen in early January, and her friends claimed that she had been depressed and planned to enlist in the Navy. Her mother would tell police that her daughter likely voluntarily entered the killer's car, as she was known to hitchhike. Although there is speculation that Ted Bundy had something to do with these crimes, there is no tangible evidence that he was in Florida during this time. In 1990, the Gainesville Ripper would go on a 4-day killing spree. 2 incoming freshmen at the University of Florida in Gainesville, Sandra Larson and Christina Powell, were at home on August 24th, 1990, when a man followed them home and broke into their house. This man would cover both of the young women's mouth with duct tape before tying their hands. Unfortunately, he would force one of the women to perform oral sex before he raped, stabbed, and killed her. And then he would return to the dead body and rape it again. Medical examiners would soon realize this person who committed the crime would cut off the girl's nipples. And even more horrifying, one of them was missing. The following day, Krista Hoyt was attacked in pretty much the same fashion. This man would break into her home, rape her, remove her nipples, and place them beside her. Unfortunately, he did something even more vicious. He would decapitate her, set her upright on the edge of the bed, and then put her head on the bookshelf. By this point, the community is absolutely petrified. 3 young university students had been murdered viciously, and really the crimes were just unimaginable, the amount of brutality. At this point, the police were telling students in the community to take every precaution necessary to protect themselves. On August 27th, 23-year-old Tracy Pauls and Manuel Taboada were murdered. It appears he killed Taboada while he slept, and then he would move on to kill Tracy. But their bodies hadn't been mutilated, and police would begin to theorize that either the killer was in danger of getting caught or had been interrupted. The murders had occurred less than 2 miles from each other, and they're all around the University of Florida. At the time, the university would cancel classes for a week. Students began to buy baseball bats, and they took them everywhere they went. They didn't go alone outside during the day or night. They triple locked their doors. Some students even had a plan to sleep in shifts, so somebody was awake at all times. By the end of August, thousands of students had left campus, and around 700 never came back because they feared for their lives. Police would have no idea who was killing these students, but they would soon learn of a man known as Danny Rolling. Danny Harold Rolling was born on May 26, 1954, to Claudia and James Rolling in Louisiana. The thing is, Danny's father had never wanted children. Although Danny's father, James, was a cop, he consistently beat his wife and children. When Danny was about a year old, his father began to abuse him. The first time he was beaten was because he wasn't crawling properly. And then in 1955, when Danny's younger brother was born, the abuse got significantly worse. Although his mother, Claudia, tried to escape the abusive marriage, it seemed that she continued to return. Unfortunately, when Danny failed the 3rd grade, due to his many absences for quote-unquote illnesses, his mother had a nervous breakdown. His school counselor would describe him as a boy suffering from an inferiority complex and that he had aggressive tendencies and poor impulse control. At age 11, Danny Rolling had been really into music, and it seemed it was his way to cope with the abuse happening at home. He played guitar and sang hymn-like songs, and around this time, his mother was committed to the hospital after she had slit her wrists. And around this time, Danny had unfortunately been doing drugs and drinking alcohol. At around 14, the neighbors found Danny peeping into their daughter's bedroom window. They would go and they would tell Danny's father, and this would only lead to him being beaten. Eventually, he would try to enlist, but the Navy wouldn't take him, so he joined the Air Force. He would eventually quit the Air Force. After being discharged from the military, he did marry and apparently just went on to have what appeared to be a normal life. At the age of 23, he had been with his wife for around 4 years, but he was going through a separation after threatening to kill his wife. In 1977, as he's going through this separation, he rapes a woman who closely resembled his ex-wife, and a year later, he would kill a woman in a car accident. From 1970 to 1990, it seemed that Danny committed a series of petty crimes and thefts. He appeared to be about 6'2" and was just this big and powerful person. He'd eventually turn to armed robberies to get cash, which meant he was in and out of prison in Louisiana, Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. And apparently he had broken out of prison several times and was fired or just quit jobs just as frequently. 3 victims were found around the time that Danny had lost his job and had returned home. 24-year-old Julie Grissom, her father Tom Grissom, and her nephew, 8-year-old Sean. And then in May of 1990, Danny would shoot his 58-year-old father twice and almost killed him. James Rolling did survive, but he lost an eye and an ear. Eventually, Danny Rolling would change his identity with papers he stole after breaking into someone's house. He fled Shreveport and took a bus to Sarasota, Florida, where he was going to start a new life as Michael Kennedy Jr. in July of 1990. And this is when the Gainesville Ripper was born. But police just couldn't find enough concrete evidence to find a suspect. They didn't know who was killing these students. It appeared that the killer never left the duct tape on the victims. It did appear that cleaning products were used on the victims to remove DNA evidence, such as semen. And some of the women's bodies were left staged in sexually suggestive positions. 2 weeks after the murders, Danny Rolling would be caught, but they didn't know that he was in fact the Gainesville Ripper. Danny Rolling, aka the Gainesville Ripper, would continue stealing and breaking into homes and gas stations until one day he was caught in Ocala after a high-speed chase. He was wanted for a robbery at the Winn-Dixie. In January of 1991, 4 months after the murders, police would finally catch a break. Because of the similarities of the murders in Shreveport and Gainesville, the investigators in Florida sought DNA of prisoners from Shreveport who were incarcerated. And at the time, Danny Rolling's DNA was similar enough to DNA left at the Gainesville murder scenes to charge him with murder. And surprisingly enough, Danny Rolling confessed to being the Gainesville Ripper. He was convicted and executed on October 25th, 2006 in Florida. Shockingly enough, 47 people witnessed the execution of Danny Rolling, which was double the capacity of the viewing room at that time. His last meal was a lobster tail served with butter, butterfly shrimp with cocktail sauce, a baked potato with sour cream and butter, strawberry cheesecake, and sweet tea. As he's waiting to be executed, he was 52 years old, and he began to sing a hymn-type song that rambled on for about 5 verses. It appears that the song that he was singing was one from childhood, the same ones he had learned to play on his guitar. The defense would call witnesses to testify that James Rolling was verbally and physically abusive to the boy from the time he was an infant, which also included that time I mentioned he abused him for not knowing how to crawl properly. Psychiatrist Dr. Robert Sadoff testified during the trial that Rolling believed he had alternate personality named Gemini who was responsible for the murders. He said that Rolling had seen the movie The Exorcist shortly before the murders. His mother, Claudia, was also called to testify, and when asked why she never left her violent husband, she said that it would, quote, driven him off the deep end. Danny Rolling would give an interview where he discussed his impending execution. He would go on to say, "I do deserve to die, but do I want to die? No, I want to live. Life is difficult to give up." Before dying, he would give a pastor a written note confessing to the 1989 triple murder of Julie Grissom, her nephew Sean, and her father William, who went by Tom. And this was in Shreveport, Louisiana. What's interesting about Danny is he's the direct opposite of the Route 40 killer, Stephen Brian Pennell. As I mentioned in my video about the Route 40 killer, I don't know really anything about Stephen. All seemed pretty okay in his life. Whereas Danny, who grew up in this incredibly abusive home from the time he was an infant to adulthood, not that it obviously makes what Danny did okay, but it does seem that he falls in line with this typical serial killer who had an abusive home life or turbulent home life. I also find it interesting that Danny's father was a police officer. He very quickly learned to make sure that the duct tape that he used on his victims was taken away. He threw it away in the garbage. He didn't leave it at the crime scene. He was also very careful to use cleaners to make sure that he didn't leave any DNA behind. It really does make you wonder how many conversations he had with his father that would lead one to suspect that he was up to no good. Danny Rolling was just this brutal, awful person. The things he did to his victims were just incredibly violent and so disheartening. But that's it for today, guys. If you like this video or any other video on my channel, be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss video upload. If there's a case you'd like me to cover, pop in the comments below, and I'll be sure to get to it. In the meantime, check out some other videos on my channel while you wait for the next upload, and I'll see you then.